I have more respect for a man who lets me know where he stands, even if he's wrong.
We always say in the Black Panther Party that they can do anything they want to us. We might not be back. I might be in jail. I might be anywhere. But when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary.
New Nubian. Juvenile Law, Policy, Procedure and Advocacy. Presented by Dr. Jonah Sanders. Course Objectives. To provide learners with a comprehensive understanding of juvenile law, covering key policies, procedural safeguards, and advocacy strategies aimed at protecting the rights and welfare of minors within the legal system. Course Outline. Module 1, Overview of Juvenile Law and Policy. Module 2, Juvenile Court Procedures. Module 3, Rights and Protections for Juveniles. Module 4, Advocacy Strategies in Juvenile Law. Module 5, Contemporary Issues and Reform Efforts. Module 6, Review and Quiz. Course Syllabus. Module topics covered. Time learning objectives. 1. Juvenile Law Overview, History, Policy Goals, 20 minutes. Understand the juvenile justice framework. 2. Court Procedures, Intake, Adjudication, Disposition, 25 minutes. Learn procedural safeguards for juveniles. 3. Juvenile Rights, Counsel, Confidentiality, 25 minutes. Know the protections juveniles enjoy. 4. Advocacy Strategies, Defense, Collaboration, 25 minutes. Develop effective juvenile advocacy skills. 5. Contemporary Issues, Disparities, Reform Efforts, 15 minutes. Identify current challenges and reforms. 6. Review and Quiz Recap plus Assessment, 10 minutes. Test knowledge retention. Module 1. Overview of Juvenile Law and Policy. History and Philosophy of the Juvenile Justice System. Philosophy and Principles. The core philosophy, rehabilitation over punishment. The doctrine of parens patriae, state as guardian. Focus on the best interests of the child. Differences from adult criminal justice, due process versus care and treatment. Modern developments and challenges. Shifts in policy toward accountability and community protection. The debate between rehabilitation and punishment today. Impact of societal views on juvenile justice policies. Differences between juvenile and adult criminal justice systems. Jurisdiction and age. Age ranges for juvenile court jurisdiction, usually under 18. When juveniles can be tried as adults and how that varies by jurisdiction. Philosophical foundations. Juvenile system focus on rehabilitation, education, and care. Adult system focus on punishment, deterrence, and public safety. The doctrine of parens patriae in juvenile cases. Procedural differences. Privacy protections in juvenile court, closed proceedings, sealed records. Differences in terminology, delinquent acts versus crimes. Differences in rights, e.g., right to jury trial often not guaranteed in juvenile court. Different sentencing options and less emphasis on incarceration for juveniles. Role of probation officers and social workers in juvenile cases. Key policy goals: rehabilitation, protection, and accountability. Rehabilitation. Definition: helping juveniles change behavior to prevent future offenses. Importance of age and development in shaping interventions. Common rehabilitation methods: counseling, education, skill building, community programs. Examples of successful rehabilitation approaches. Challenges in achieving rehabilitation, resources, varying individual needs. Protection. Protection of the community from harm. Protection of the juvenile from further victimization or harm. Role of the juvenile justice system in ensuring safety inside detention facilities and through supervision. Balancing community safety with juvenile needs. Accountability. Ensuring juveniles understand consequences for their actions. Encouraging responsibility and making amends, restorative justice, community service. Accountability as a tool to promote personal growth and deter future offenses. How accountability is integrated without excessive punishment. Federal and state statutes governing juvenile law. Federal statutes. Overview of key federal laws related to juvenile justice, e.g., Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, JJDPA. Purpose and main provisions of the JJDPA: deinstitutionalization of status offenders, sight and sound separation from adult inmates, removal of juveniles from adult jails, and reduction of disproportionate minority contact. Other relevant federal laws influencing juvenile rights and protections. Role of federal funding and oversight in state juvenile justice systems. State statutes. State's primary role in defining juvenile law and procedures. Variation in age, jurisdiction, and definitions of delinquency. Examples of state statutes addressing intake, detention, adjudication, and disposition processes. State laws regarding transfer to adult court, waiver laws. Impact of state statutes on detention conditions, confidentiality, and rehabilitation programs. Interaction between federal and state law. How federal statutes set minimum standards that states must follow. States can enact more protective or stringent laws but cannot go below federal standards. Examples of conflicts or harmonization between state and federal laws. Module 2. Juvenile Court Procedures. Intake and Detention Procedures. Intake Procedures. Role of the intake officer or probation officer. Steps involved in intake: interviewing juvenile and family, reviewing police reports, assessing the case. Possible outcomes of intake: dismissal, informal adjustment, referral to court. Factors influencing intake decisions: severity of offense, prior record, family situation. Importance of diversion programs and alternatives to formal court processing. Detention procedures. Purpose of detention: protecting public safety, ensuring juvenile appears in court, and safeguarding the juvenile. Criteria for detention decisions: seriousness of offense, risk of flight, risk to community or self. Types of detention facilities: secure, non-secure, shelter homes. Legal protections and rights during detention, timely hearings, conditions of confinement. Issues related to overuse and consequences of detention. Adjudication process and standards of proof. Overview of the adjudication process. Steps in adjudication: filing the petition, arraignment, pre-trial motions, adjudicatory hearing. Role of the judge and parties involved: juvenile, attorneys, probation officer, witnesses. How adjudication differs from adult trials: no jury in most juvenile courts. Importance of due process rights for juveniles: right to counsel, right to confront witnesses. Standards of proof. Explain the beyond a reasonable doubt standard used in juvenile adjudications. Compare with preponderance of the evidence and other standards used in civil cases. How the standard protects juveniles' rights while balancing public safety. Challenges in meeting the standard and impact on outcomes. Rights of juveniles: counsel, Miranda warnings, and confidentiality. Right to counsel. Explanation of the right to legal representation for juveniles. When and how juveniles receive counsel: public defender or private attorney. Role of counsel in protecting juvenile rights and guiding them through the process. Discussion of cases where juveniles may waive their right to counsel and the safeguards involved. Importance of effective counsel for fair outcomes. Miranda warnings. What are Miranda warnings? When must police provide Miranda warnings to juveniles? Differences in how Miranda rights apply to juveniles versus adults. How courts evaluate if a juvenile's waiver of Miranda rights was voluntary and knowing. Impact of Miranda warnings on juvenile interrogations and confessions. Confidentiality of juvenile records. Purpose of confidentiality in juvenile justice. Laws and policies protecting juvenile records from public disclosure. Conditions under which records can be accessed or expunged. Importance of confidentiality for rehabilitation and future opportunities. Disposition hearings and sentencing options. Disposition hearing process. When disposition hearings occur, after adjudication. Parties involved, judge, juvenile, attorneys, probation officers, and family. Considerations the judge takes into account: nature of the offense, juvenile's background, reports from probation officers, victim impact statements. Emphasis on individualized treatment plans. Sentencing options in juvenile court. Overview of various disposition options. Probation, most common. Community service. Restitution to victims. Counseling and rehabilitation programs. Placement in juvenile detention or residential treatment facilities. Electronic monitoring or house arrest. Factors influencing sentencing choice: severity, prior record, risk to community. Role of restorative justice approaches. Module 3. Rights and protections for juveniles. Due process rights in juvenile proceedings. Overview of due process rights. Right to notice of charges. Right to counsel, legal representation. Right to a fair and impartial hearing. Right to confront and cross-examine witnesses. Right against self-incrimination. Right to an adequate opportunity to prepare a defense. Application in juvenile proceedings. How due process is adapted for juveniles, more informal than adult courts but still protective. Differences in procedural safeguards, e.g., no jury trial in most juvenile courts. The impact of landmark cases, e.g., in re Galt, establishing juvenile due process rights. Examples of procedural steps ensuring due process during hearings. Challenges and limitations. Balancing informal process with protecting rights. Variations in due process protections across jurisdictions. Potential gaps or shortcomings in protecting juveniles' due process rights. Right to counsel and effective assistance. Right to counsel, legal basis and scope. Overview of landmark cases, e.g., in re Galt, establishing right to counsel. When the right to counsel applies, all stages of juvenile proceedings. Differences between public defenders and private attorneys. Role of counsel in protecting juvenile rights. Effective assistance of counsel. What constitutes effective assistance? Competent, diligent, and zealous representation. Challenges juveniles face without effective counsel. Importance of communication between attorney and juvenile. Examples of how effective counsel can influence case outcomes: diversion, reduced sentences, safeguarding rights. Consequences of ineffective counsel: appeals, miscarriages of justice. Safeguards and support for counsel. Training and resources for juvenile defense attorneys. Importance of specialized juvenile defense programs. Role of guardians ad litem or advocates when necessary. Protection against self-incrimination and coercion. Legal basis for protection. Overview of the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Landmark cases relevant to juveniles, e.g., in re Gault. How these protections apply in juvenile interrogations and court proceedings. Coercion and juvenile vulnerability. Why juveniles are more susceptible to coercion and pressure. Examples of coercive tactics used during interrogations. Importance of ensuring confessions are voluntary and reliable. Role of attorneys, parents, and advocates in protecting juveniles. Practical protections and procedures. Requirement of Miranda warnings and special considerations for juveniles. Presence of counsel or guardian during questioning. Policies limiting length and conditions of interrogations for juveniles. How courts evaluate voluntariness of statements. Privacy and confidentiality laws affecting juveniles. Legal framework governing privacy and confidentiality. Overview of key laws and regulations, e.g., Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, state confidentiality statutes. Differences between federal and state laws. Scope of protections, records, hearings, and information sharing. Confidentiality of juvenile records. Types of juvenile records protected: court files, detention records, police records. Who can access juvenile records and under what conditions? Procedures for sealing or expunging records. Importance of confidentiality for rehabilitation and reducing stigma. Confidentiality of juvenile records. Types of juvenile records protected: court files, detention records, police records. Who can access juvenile records and under what conditions? Procedures for sealing or expunging records. Importance of confidentiality for rehabilitation and reducing stigma. Privacy in juvenile court proceedings. Closed hearings and restricted public access. Use of pseudonyms and limits on media reporting. Impact of privacy protections on juveniles' futures, education, employment. Module 4. Advocacy Strategies in Juvenile Law. Role of juvenile defense attorneys and guardians ad litem. Juvenile defense attorneys. Purpose and responsibilities of juvenile defense attorneys. How defense attorneys protect juveniles' legal rights throughout the process. Importance of client-attorney communication and trust. Strategies defense attorneys use: negotiating diversion, challenging evidence, ensuring fair treatment. Challenges faced by defense attorneys in juvenile cases. Guardians ad litem. Definition and purpose of guardians ad litem, GAL. Differences between GALs and defense attorneys. Responsibilities of GALs: representing the best interests of the child, making recommendations to the court. How GALs work with juveniles, families, attorneys, and the court. Situations when a GAL is appointed. Multidisciplinary collaboration, social workers, psychologists. Social workers. Responsibilities of social workers in juvenile cases: assessment, case management, family support. How social workers contribute to rehabilitation and community reintegration. Examples of social work interventions: counseling, connecting families to resources, monitoring progress. Challenges faced by social workers in the juvenile justice system. Psychologists. Psychological evaluations and assessments, mental health, risk, competency. Providing expert testimony in court regarding juvenile behavior and needs. Designing treatment plans and interventions tailored to the juvenile's psychological profile. Importance of trauma-informed care in juvenile justice. Challenges psychologists face working within the legal system. Benefits and challenges of collaboration. How collaboration improves case outcomes and promotes holistic care. Potential challenges: communication gaps, differing professional perspectives. Strategies to enhance effective teamwork. Family involvement and support services. Family in juvenile justice. How family engagement influences juvenile rehabilitation and court outcomes. Importance of communication between families and legal professionals. Challenges families may face: stigma, lack of resources, understanding the system. Strategies to encourage positive family involvement. Support services available. Types of support services: counseling, parenting programs, substance abuse treatment, educational assistance. Role of community organizations and agencies in providing support. How support services address underlying issues contributing to juvenile delinquency. Coordination between support services and the juvenile justice system. Effective advocacy for rehabilitation and diversion programs. Introduction. Define rehabilitation and diversion programs within the juvenile justice context. Highlight the significance of advocacy in promoting alternatives to formal adjudication and incarceration. Brief overview of the positive impacts of these programs on juvenile outcomes. Understanding rehabilitation and diversion programs. Rehabilitation. Goals: behavioral change, skill development, addressing underlying issues, mental health, substance abuse, family dynamics. Common types: counseling, educational/vocational programs, therapy, mentoring. Understanding rehabilitation and diversion programs. Diversion. Definition: alternatives to formal court processing aimed at preventing deeper justice system involvement. Examples: informal supervision, community service, restorative justice, mediation. Benefits to juveniles: reduced stigma, better reintegration, and the community, lower recidivism, cost savings. Advocacy strategies for promoting rehabilitation and diversion. Building the case for rehabilitation and diversion. Gathering and presenting evidence on juveniles' background, strengths, and risks. Utilizing assessments from social workers, psychologists, and educators to support advocacy. Communication and collaboration. Working closely with multidisciplinary teams, social workers, counselors, probation officers. Educating judges, prosecutors, and stakeholders on program benefits and success stories. Advocacy strategies for promoting rehabilitation and diversion. Tailoring advocacy to individual needs. Understanding each juvenile's unique circumstances to recommend appropriate programs. Advocating for culturally competent and trauma-informed programs. Addressing barriers. Tackling limited program availability and systemic biases. Proposing creative or community-based alternatives when formal programs are lacking. Strategies for overcoming resistance from courts or families. Monitoring and evaluating advocacy outcomes. Importance of tracking juvenile progress and program effectiveness. Tools and metrics for measuring success, recidivism rates, educational attainment, behavioral improvements. Using outcomes data to refine advocacy approaches and influence policy. Module 5. Contemporary Issues and Reform Efforts. Disproportionate minority contact and racial disparities. Causes and contributing factors. Systemic biases and institutional racism. Socioeconomic factors and community conditions. Differences in policing, charging, and prosecutorial decisions. Role of implicit bias and cultural misunderstandings. Reform efforts and strategies. Federal initiatives such as the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act's DMC mandate. State and local reforms, diversion programs targeting minority youth, bias training for law enforcement and court personnel. Community-based approaches and restorative justice programs. Importance of data collection and transparency. Juvenile sentencing reform and alternatives to incarceration. Juvenile sentencing. Traditional sentencing approaches and their limitations. The impact of harsh sentencing on juveniles, recidivism, mental health, social consequences. Key Supreme Court decisions influencing juvenile sentencing reform, e.g., Miller v. Alabama. Sentencing reform efforts. Legislative and policy changes aimed at reducing incarceration rates. Trends toward individualized sentencing based on risk and needs assessments. Role of advocacy in promoting reform, public awareness, legal challenges, policy lobbying. Examples of states or jurisdictions with successful reform initiatives. Alternatives to incarceration. Overview of effective alternatives. Community-based programs, probation, mentoring, family therapy. Diversion and restorative justice initiatives. Educational and vocational training programs. Mental health and substance abuse treatment. Benefits of alternatives, lower recidivism, improved outcomes, cost-effectiveness. Challenges to implementing alternatives. Funding, public perception, capacity. Impact of trauma and mental health on juvenile offenders. Prevalence of trauma and mental health issues among juveniles. Statistics on trauma exposure and mental health disorders in juvenile populations. Common types of trauma affecting juveniles: abuse, neglect, community violence. Mental health conditions prevalent among juvenile offenders: PTSD, depression, anxiety. Effects of trauma and mental health on behavior and offending. How trauma influences juvenile behavior, decision-making, and risk of offending. Connection between untreated mental health issues and recidivism. Challenges juveniles face in coping with trauma and mental illness within the justice system. Trauma-informed approaches in juvenile justice. Principles of trauma-informed care. Strategies for courts, probation officers, and service providers to address trauma. Benefits of trauma-informed interventions on rehabilitation and reducing reoffending. Recent legislative and policy changes. Key recent legislative changes. Highlight major federal laws and amendments affecting juvenile justice, e.g., updates to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. Overview of significant state-level reforms, raising the age of juvenile jurisdiction, limits on juvenile transfer to adult court, sentencing reforms. Examples of laws addressing mental health, education, and rehabilitation services for juveniles. Policy changes and trends. Shift towards restorative justice and community-based alternatives. Policies enhancing protections for minority youth and addressing disparities. Increased emphasis on trauma-informed care and mental health services. Development of data collection and transparency initiatives. Module 6. Review and Quiz. Summary of key concepts. Overview of juvenile law and policy. History and philosophy of the juvenile justice system. Differences between juvenile and adult criminal justice systems. Key policy goals: rehabilitation, protection, and accountability. Federal and state statutes governing juvenile law. Juvenile court procedures. Intake and detention procedures. Adjudication process and standards of proof. Rights of juveniles, counsel, Miranda warnings, and confidentiality. Disposition hearings and sentencing options. Rights and protections for juveniles. Due process rights in juvenile proceedings. Right to counsel and effective assistance. Protection against self-incrimination and coercion. Privacy and confidentiality laws affecting juveniles. Advocacy strategies in juvenile law. Role of juvenile defense attorneys and guardians ad litem. Multidisciplinary collaboration, social workers, psychologists. Family involvement and support services. Effective advocacy for rehabilitation and diversion programs. Contemporary issues and reform efforts. Disproportionate minority contact and racial disparities. Juvenile sentencing reform and alternatives to incarceration. Impact of trauma and mental health on juvenile offenders. Recent legislative and policy changes. 10-question quiz to assess understanding. Question quiz. 1. What is the primary philosophical goal of the juvenile justice system? A. Punishment. B. Rehabilitation. C. Retribution. D. Deterrence. Answer: B. Rehabilitation. 2. At what age can juveniles typically be transferred to adult court? A. 16. B. 18. C. It varies by jurisdiction. D. 21. Answer: C. It varies by jurisdiction. 3. Which federal act focuses on reducing disproportionate minority contact in juvenile justice? A. Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, JJDPA. B. Juvenile Justice Reform Act. C. Juvenile Protection Act. D. Child Welfare Act. Answer: A. Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, JJDPA. 4. During the intake process, which of the following is not a possible outcome? A. Dismissal. B. Informal adjustment. C. Immediate incarceration. D. Referral to court. Answer: C. Immediate incarceration. 5. What is the standard of proof in juvenile adjudication hearings? A. Preponderance of the evidence. B. Clear and convincing evidence. C. Beyond a reasonable doubt. D. Probable cause. Answer: C. Beyond a reasonable doubt. 6. Which right ensures juveniles have access to legal representation? A. Right to counsel. B. Right to privacy. C. Right to bail. D. Right to a jury trial. Answer: A. Right to counsel. 7. What does parens patriae mean in juvenile justice? A. The state acts as the parent to protect juveniles. B. Juveniles have no rights. C. Punishment is the main goal. D. Juveniles must be tried as adults. Answer: A. The state acts as the parent to protect juveniles. 8. What is a key benefit of diversion programs? A. Increased incarceration rates. B. Avoiding formal court processing. C. Harsh sentencing. D. Public shaming. Answer: B. Avoiding formal court processing. 9. What federal amendment protects juveniles from self-incrimination? A. Fourth Amendment. B. Fifth Amendment. C. Sixth Amendment. D. Eighth Amendment. Answer: B. Fifth Amendment. 10. Why is family involvement important in juvenile justice? A. To increase punishment. B. To support rehabilitation and positive outcomes. C. To limit legal rights. D. To speed up sentencing. Answer: B. To support rehabilitation and positive outcomes.
Thank you.